Australia is planning to turn its lifeless desert into a vast inland sea at the cost of $200 billion. The proposed area is larger than France and Germany combined. If the plan is realized, a massive new sea the size of the Great Lakes in the United States will appear in the center of the Australian continent. This will become the most ambitious engineering project in human history. For comparison, the entire Apollo moon landing program cost much less. The plan includes building giant desalination plants on the coast and a pipeline system stretching hundreds of kilometers inland. It would require solar power plants the size of entire cities and pumping stations capable of moving oceanic volumes of water. Filling the new sea would take about 20 years of continuous effort. But why would Australia need such a massive project? To understand this, we need to look at the continent's geography. Australia is comparable in size to the U.S., but nearly the entire country is desert. About 80% of its land is practically uninhabitable. All major cities are strung along a narrow coastal strip. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, all are on the ocean. In the center of the country, in an area the size of Texas and California combined, fewer people live than in Los Angeles. Central Australia is a climatic hell. In summer, temperatures exceed 45 degrees Celsius. In winter, they can drop below freezing. Rain is rare, sometimes absent for years. The soil is poor and saline, with only thorny bushes surviving. The nearest hospital may be hundreds of kilometers away. The nearest store, dozens. Mobile coverage exists only along major roads. Even a regular bottle of water in remote areas can cost as much as a meal at McDonald's. Historically, European colonists settled only along the coast, where there was access to the sea for trade, a milder climate, and fertile land. Moving inland was extremely dangerous. Many expeditions ended tragically due to lack of water and extreme heat. In the 1840s, the famous explorer Charles Sturt searched for a mythical inland sea in Central Australia, but found only lifeless desert. As a result, 25 million Australians live on a narrow strip of land, while vast areas remain empty after 200 years. It's like if all of America lived only in California and Florida, and the rest was a lifeless desert. And it's precisely this dead zone that Australia now wants to turn into a thriving region, with a sea in the middle. The idea isn't new. It was born nearly a century ago. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, engineer John Bradfield proposed a revolutionary plan. He was famous for building the iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge. In 1938, he presented a plan for creating an inland sea, known as the Bradfield Scheme. The idea was simple. Construct a network of dams, canals, and pumping stations spanning 2,300 kilometers. Redirect water from the tropical rivers of northern Queensland into Lake Eyre, a giant salt basin in central Australia. The lake lies 15 meters below sea level, so water would naturally flow into it. Bradfield promised grand results. The new sea would change the continent's climate, create green fields, new cities, and hydroelectric plants. The project would generate thousands of jobs and transform Australia into an agricultural superpower. During the Depression, it sounded like salvation. Lake Eyre is indeed unique. It's the lowest point in Australia, a vast salt plain larger than England. Most of the time, it looks like a cracked white crust under the sun. But once a decade, when heavy rains fall up north, rivers bring water that turns it into a mirror-like lake visible from space. Flamingos and pelicans come to breed. Unfortunately, within a few months, the water evaporates and the lake returns to its lifeless state. Bradfield wanted to make this miracle permanent, but engineers quickly ran into problems. The Central Australian sun evaporates water 10 times faster than rain can replenish it. Even with constant water supply, the lake would become a hypersaline dead zone. The project cost was astronomical, equivalent to tens of billions in today's dollars. But the biggest issue was salt. In a closed basin, salt accumulates until the water becomes toxic to all life. The idea was shelved, though not entirely abandoned. Over the next 80 years, the dream resurfaced repeatedly. In the 1960s, politicians discussed again. In the 1980s, new proposals appeared, but every time they hit the same obstacles: physics, economics, and technological limitations. A major blow to this seemingly promising idea came from one of the greatest environmental disasters of the 20th century, in the USSR. The Soviet Aral Sea disaster became a nightmare warning for the entire world about what happens when humans try to reshape nature on a grand scale. In the 1960s, Soviet officials aimed to turn Central Asian deserts into fertile fields. The idea seemed noble and ambitious. Redirect the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, which fed the Aral Sea, toward irrigation of cotton plantations in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The goal was to make the USSR the world's top cotton producer, feed the nation, and earn billions from exporting the white gold. The Aral Sea seemed inexhaustible. It was the fourth largest lake in the world, bigger than Ireland, up to 70 meters deep. Locals called it a sea, and rightly so. 70,000 square kilometers of blue water, waves, fishing fleets, and resort towns. It held 20 fish species and supported thriving fishing cities like Aralsk and Minac, each with tens of thousands of residents. Soviet engineers were confident in success. They built a massive network of canals totaling 40,000 kilometers, longer than Earth's equator. The main one, the Karakum Canal, stretched 1,400 kilometers across Turkmenistan's deserts. Hundreds of thousands of people worked on construction, using explosives and excavators to cut through mountains and deserts. For a few years, it seemed like a triumph. Deserts truly bloomed. Cotton fields stretched the horizon. Harvest grew, and the USSR became the world's second-largest cotton producer after the U.S. New cities and irrigation systems appeared in Uzbekistan, along with cotton processing plants. Officials celebrated humanity's victory over nature. But by the 1970s, early warning signs appeared. The Aral Sea's level began dropping faster than expected. Shores retreated, exposing the lake bed. Fishermen in port cities watched in horror as the sea receded by kilometers. Salinity rose, and fish began to die. By the 1980s, the tragedy was obvious. The Aral Sea had shrunk by half. The port of Aralsk was now 40 kilometers from the water. Fishing boats stood stranded on dry ground, monuments to human folly. Salinity had increased tenfold. The sea became a giant salt bath where no life could survive. The real horror began in the 1990s. The Aral Sea split into several disconnected water bodies. What was once a single sea turned into a chain of salty lakes surrounded by a white crust. Winds lifted millions of tons of salt from the dry seabed, mixed with pesticide and fertilizer residues from the cotton fields. These toxic dust storms became a true disaster. Poisonous dust was carried by the wind for thousands of kilometers, even reaching Europe. In the region, there was a sharp increase in cancer rates, kidney disease, respiratory illnesses, and infertility. Child mortality in Karakum-Pakistan, a region near the former sea, became one of the highest in the world. The economic consequences were catastrophic. The fishing industry, which once supported 60,000 people, disappeared completely. The city of Minac, once a thriving fishing port, turned into a ghost town in the middle of a salty desert. People fled the region en masse, and the population in some areas was cut in half. The climate changed drastically. Without the Aral Sea to moderate the continental climate, winters became colder and summers hotter. The rains that used to form due to sea evaporation vanished. The region turned into a lifeless desert with an extremely harsh continental climate. By the 2000s, the Aral Sea had shrunk by 90%. What was once the fourth largest lake in the world became a few small, salty water bodies. In its place emerged the Aralkum Desert, 40,000 square kilometers of salt, pesticides, and toxic dust. Satellite images revealed the scale of the disaster. Where there once was a blue expanse, now there was only a gray-white wasteland. Environmentalists call the disappearance of the Aral Sea one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, who visited the region in 2010, said, "This is one of the most shocking disasters on the planet. It's hard to believe this is not a natural catastrophe, but the result of human actions. Attempts to save the Aral Sea were made repeatedly, but unsuccessfully. In the 2000s, a dam was built that partially restored the northern part of the sea in Kazakhstan, but the southern part in Uzbekistan kept drying up. International organizations spend billions of dollars on regional aid programs, but restoring the sea to its original size proved impossible. The most frightening part is that the disaster was predictable. Back in the 1960s, Soviet scientists warned about the possible consequences. They calculated that diverting the rivers would lead to the seas drying up, but the Soviet leadership ignored all warnings. Short-term economic gains seemed more important than long-term environmental risks. The story of the Aral Sea became a symbol of how grand plans to reshape nature can end in horror. It showed that large water bodies cannot be seen as isolated systems. They're connected to climate, ecosystems, and the lives of millions of people in complex ways we don't fully understand. That's why, when talk of reviving the Australian Inland Sea Project began again in the 2020s, environmentalists around the world raised the alarm. "Don't repeat the USSR's mistakes," became their main slogan. The Aral catastrophe became the key argument against Australia's Grand Inland Sea Plan. Australia's inland sea ambitions started to seem like madness. For a long time, no one took these dangerous fantasies seriously. But in the 2020s, the idea suddenly came back to life. And this time, it's more real than ever. What changed? First, the water crisis in Australia reached a point of no return. The country is experiencing a water apocalypse. Since 2017, Eastern Australia has been gripped by the worst drought in 400 years of observation. This isn't just dry weather. It's a collapse of the continent's water systems. Imagine the city of Tamworth, population 60,000, more than in some European capitals, was on the brink of running out of water. Reservoirs dried up by 90%. Residents stood in kilometer-long lines for drinking water delivered by military tankers from other states. People washed with buckets, did laundry once a week, and children hadn't seen full bathtubs in months. The situation was even worse in the town of Stanthorpe. 5,000 people were left without any running water at all. Central water supply was completely shut off. Each family received 100 liters of water per day. That's less than an average American uses for a single shower. Imagine cooking, drinking, bathing, washing, all within 100 liters. People had to choose between a shower and making dinner. In rural areas, a real tragedy began. Farmers were slaughtering livestock en masse. Not for sale, but because there was no water to keep the animals alive. Over 3 years of drought, Australia's cattle population dropped by 10 million. 1/3 of all livestock in the country. Farms that had been passed down for 150 years were sold for nothing or simply abandoned. Entire families left lands their great-great-grandparents had lived on. John McCartney, a farmer from New South Wales, told journalists, "I shot 400 head of cattle last month, not because I wanted to, because they were dying of thirst. My family ran this farm for 70 years. Now I'm the last one." There are thousands of such stories. But the real nightmare came with the fires of 2019 to 2020, known as Black Summer. This wasn't just a natural disaster. It was the end of the world in one country. An area larger than the UK and Ireland combined burned down. To understand the scale, it's as if fire destroyed everything from New York to Chicago. 3 billion animals died. Kangaroos, koalas, birds, reptiles burned alive. Smoke rose 15 kilometers into the atmosphere and circled the entire planet. NASA's satellites detected the smoke over South America and Antarctica. The sun over New Zealand shone red because of Australian smoke. The air in Sydney became more toxic than in Beijing during its worst smog days. The economic damage exceeded $100 billion. But money wasn't the worst part. Entire towns burned to the ground. The town of Malakuta turned into a trap. 4,000 people were surrounded by fire and had to take refuge on the beach, waiting for evacuation by Navy ships. Air temperatures reached 48 degrees Celsius. Ash fell like snow, and the sky turned orange-black. Firefighters worked for months without rest, but the flames were stronger. Traditional firefighting methods didn't work. Fires moved at 80 kilometers per hour, creating their own fire tornadoes several kilometers high. Fire trucks melted from the heat. Helicopters couldn't take off due to smoke and turbulence. Even major cities were threatened. Melbourne, Australia's second-largest city, imposed severe water restrictions. Residents were limited to 50 liters of water per person per day. That meant 3-minute showers, laundry once a week, no lawns, no pools, no car washing. In some Sydney suburbs, police patrolled the streets, issuing fines to people who water their gardens. But even these measures weren't enough. Reservoirs supplying major cities were drying up. Warragamba Dam, which supplies half of Sydney's water, was only 40% full, the lowest level in history. Engineers calculated that if the drought lasted another 2 years, the 5 million strong Sydney would run out of water entirely. The economic losses are growing like an avalanche. Agriculture, the traditional backbone of Australian exports, is collapsing before our eyes. Wheat yields have dropped by 20%, meaning Australia has significantly lost its position in the global grain market. Cotton production has fallen by 40%. Entire regions that once specialized in cotton farming are turning into wastelands. Dairy farming is relocating en masse closer to the coast, where water still exists. Famous wine-producing valleys are switching to drought-resistant grape varieties, or even shifting to completely different crops. The tourism industry, which brings in $60 billion annually, is losing billions. The Great Barrier Reef, Australia's top tourist attraction, is bleaching and dying from heat. Over the past 5 years, 50% of the coral has perished. National parks are closing for months due to extreme fire danger. Foreign tourists are canceling trips, fearing wildfires and smoke. Insurance companies are pulling out of drought-prone regions. In some areas, home insurance costs $20,000 a year, more than many families pay for a mortgage. Banks are refusing to issue loans for property in risk zones, which expand each year. Land prices in central regions have dropped by 70%. The social consequences are catastrophic. Suicide rates among farmers have reached historic highs. One farmer takes their own life every 4 days. Psychologists are calling it an epidemic of depression driven by climate disaster. Children in drought-stricken areas don't even remember what full rivers look like. For them, drought is the norm. Traditional solutions are exhausted. In the past 20 years, Australia has built dozens of new reservoirs at a cost of $50 billion. The result? They're empty. There's nothing to fill them with. Rain falls less frequently, and what rain does come often evaporates before reaching the reservoirs. Desalination of seawater partly works for large cities, but it's incredibly expensive and consumes huge amounts of energy. A cubic meter of desalinated water costs 5 times more than regular water. Moreover, desalination plants can support city populations, but they don't solve the problems of agriculture and remote regions, where 30% of Australians live. Saving water at home has minimal effect. Even if every Australian cut their water use in half, it would only compensate for 5% of the drought-related losses. The problem isn't overuse. There's simply less water each year. Australia is caught in a deadly trap. The climate is becoming increasingly arid. The population keeps growing. The economy demands water, and the water just isn't there. Scientists predict that by 2050, the situation will get even worse. The average temperature will rise by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, and rainfall will decrease by 20%. Traditional drought-fighting methods don't work anymore, and the time to find alternatives is running out. The country needs a radical solution, or it risks becoming an uninhabitable desert. This is the backdrop for revival of the inland sea idea. When your house is on fire, you'll do anything to put it out. The key difference now is a revolution in technology. In the 1930s, Bradfield had only one water source, rivers, which are unpredictable. Pumps consumed enormous energy from coal power plants. Desalination was astronomically expensive. Nobody knew what to do with the salt. Today, things have changed dramatically. Solar energy is now cheaper than coal. Australia is one of the sunniest countries in the world, and modern panels can power massive pumping stations almost for free. Desalination has become hundreds of times cheaper thanks to new membrane technologies. Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia now produce billions of liters of desalinated water daily. New technologies allow industrial extraction of valuable materials from seawater. Modern plants can recover salt, lithium, magnesium, and other minerals for export. Computer modeling can predict the impact of a new sea on climate and ecosystems decades in advance. That's why, in 2020, the project Australian Inland Sea 2.0 was proposed. The plan is radically different from Bradfield's. Instead of rivers, seawater. Instead of coal plants, solar. Instead of avoiding salt, industrial extraction. The idea is simple. Build giant desalination plants on the southern coast, solar power stations, and a pipeline system to transport water 600 kilometers inland to Lake Eyre. If the lake is filled with salt water and continually replenished, it won't dry out. The salt can be harvested and sold, turning a problem into a source of income. Supporters present strong arguments. The new sea will change the regional microclimate. Evaporation will trigger rainfall, lower temperatures, and increase humidity. Within a few hundred kilometers of the lake, the climate will become milder and more suitable for agriculture. Around the sea, eco-friendly cities powered by solar energy can be built. Tourism could thrive. Imagine desert resorts with views of a vast inland lake. Agricultural zones with drip irrigation could emerge. Industrial plants for processing minerals from salt water could be built. The project would create hundreds of thousands of jobs at all stages, from construction to maintenance. It would attract international investment. It would make Australia a global leader in renewable energy and water desalination. Most importantly, it could help combat the droughts that threaten to devastate the entire economy. There are also economic benefits. Extracting salt, lithium, and other minerals from seawater is a booming industry. Lithium is essential for electric vehicle batteries. Salt is used in the chemical industry. Exporting these materials could partially offset the cost of the project. Solar power plants around the lake could supply all of Australia with energy. Surplus electricity could be exported to neighboring countries via underwater cables. Asian countries are already eager to buy clean energy. New inland cities would reduce pressure on overcrowded coastal megacities. Real estate prices in Sydney and Melbourne have reached absurd levels. Most young families can't afford housing. Cities around the inland sea could become an affordable alternative. Technologically, the project is feasible. Desalination plants are operating worldwide. Pipelines of this length already exist in China and other countries. Solar power plants of the necessary scale are being built in Saudi Arabia. Modern pumping stations can handle the needed water volumes. But there are serious concerns. The projected cost of $200 billion exceeds Australia's annual federal budget. Such funding requires international investment and long-term political stability. Pipelines of this length are vulnerable to malfunctions, terrorism, and natural disasters. The environmental impact remains uncertain. Even the most advanced computer models can be wrong. Nature is too complex. Salt water could sterilize the soil in large areas around the lake, making farming impossible. There are also social issues. Lake Eyre is sacred to the Arabana people. They call it Katie Thanda and believe the spirits of their ancestors reside there. For Aboriginal communities, flooding the lake is equivalent to destroying a temple. Elder Aaron Stewart said, "Our stories are written in this land. You can't drown them." The project also raises concerns about social justice. Central Australia is one of the country's poorest regions, especially for Indigenous communities. Spending $200 billion on a mega project while people lack decent housing, healthcare, and education seems cynical. Critics point to alternatives. The same budget could build thousands of small desalination plants, improve rainwater harvesting systems, develop water reuse technologies, and invest in drought-resistant crops. This approach would be less risky and more flexible. But supporters argue that small solutions won't fix the core problem. Australia needs a breakthrough, not cosmetic changes. The climate crisis demands radical action. The project is currently under study. The government has commissioned detailed assessments of its environmental impact, economic feasibility, and technical viability. International investment funds are showing cautious interest. Environmental groups are demanding safety guarantees. A decision must be made in the next few years. If approved, construction will begin by 2030 and take 2 decades. If rejected, Australia will have to find other ways to tackle the water crisis. The Australian Inland Sea remains one of the boldest and most controversial projects of our time. It's an attempt to turn a climate curse into a blessing, a desert into an oasis, a problem into an opportunity. But the price of failure is enormous, and there are no guarantees of success. The world is watching and waiting. Will Australia take the leap that could change its future forever?